Alright y'all, buckle up, because today we're diving into one of the most straight-up savage moments in all of human history, the total, complete, no-holds-barred destruction of Carthage. And I don't mean they lost a war, packed up their stuff, and called it a day. I mean they literally wiped this city off the face of the earth. Like, gone, deleted, finished. The Romans didn't just beat Carthage, they erased it so hard that for centuries people weren't even totally sure where it had been. So let's rewind the clock and figure out how we even got here, because this story is wild from start to finish. Carthage didn't just appear out of nowhere. This was a legit powerhouse civilization, one of the most dominant forces in the ancient Mediterranean world. Founded by Phoenician settlers, traditionally around 814 BCE, near what is now modern-day Tunis in Tunisia, Carthage grew from a small trading post into an absolute monster of an empire. And I mean that in the best way possible for a long time, at least. These people were hustlers in every sense of the word. They built their wealth on trade, their navy was insanely powerful, and at their peak, they controlled significant chunks of North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Like, this wasn't some rinky-dink little city-state. Carthage was the real deal. Their economy was booming, their culture was rich, and their military, while maybe not as traditionally dominant as some of their rivals, was nothing to sleep on. They hired mercenaries from all over the known world, which honestly was both a strength and a massive weakness, but we'll get to that. Now, here's the thing, Carthage and Rome were bound to clash eventually. You've got two massive, ambitious, expansionist powers sharing the same Mediterranean neighborhood, and at some point, something's gotta give. That collision point? Sicily. This beautiful, strategic island sitting right between the two powers became the spark that lit the whole thing off. The First Punic War, which kicked off in 264 BCE, was basically Rome and Carthage going at each other over who gets to control Sicily and the surrounding waters. Rome, which was mostly a land-based power at this point, had to get real good at naval warfare real fast. And honestly, they did. They literally copied Carthaginian ship designs, built a whole fleet basically from scratch, and started wrecking. After over 2 decades of brutal fighting, Rome came out on top. Carthage had to give up Sicily and pay a massive indemnity. That stung. That really, truly stung. But Carthage being Carthage, they adapted. They pushed harder into Spain, under the Barcid family, and yes, that name should ring a bell, because this family produced one of the most legendary military figures in all of history. We're talking about Hannibal Barca, his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, and most famously, Hamilcar's son Hannibal. Now, Hannibal Barca is the kind of dude that history nerds lose their minds over, and for good reason. This man was an absolute tactical genius. He grew up hating Rome. Legend has it that when he was just a kid, he begged his father to take him on campaign, and Hamilcar made him swear an oath of eternal enmity toward Rome. Whether that story is completely accurate or embellished over time, the sentiment was real. Hannibal went on to do something so audacious, so completely unhinged in the best possible way, that it still gets studied in military academies today. He marched an army including war elephants over the Alps into Italy. Let that sink in. The Alps, in winter, with elephants. This man was built different. And when he got into Italy, he went off. The Battle of Trebia in 218 BCE, the Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, and then the absolute masterpiece, the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where Hannibal encircled and destroyed a Roman army of somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 men. Cannae is still considered one of the most tactically perfect battles ever fought. Hannibal spent years running around Italy, winning battle after battle, and Rome was genuinely shook, like legitimately terrified. But here's where it gets interesting. Rome didn't break. These guys were stubborn as heck. They switched strategies, started avoiding pitched battles with Hannibal, and instead focused on cutting off his supplies and support. And eventually, they took the fight back to Africa. Scipio Africanus, another all-timer, went to North Africa and threatened Carthage directly, forcing Hannibal to come home. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal and the Second Punic War was over. Carthage got hit even harder this time, more territory lost, and even bigger indemnity. Their military was severely restricted, and they basically had to ask Rome's permission to defend themselves. Humiliating doesn't even begin to cover it. But here's the wild part, even after all of that, Carthage bounced back economically. These people were resilient as heck. They paid off their war indemnity way ahead of schedule, which honestly seems like something that should have been celebrated, but in Rome it just made people more nervous. Because a recovering Carthage was still a powerful Carthage, and powerful things have a way of becoming threats. Enter Marcus Porcius Cato, better known as Cato the Elder, and honestly one of the most stubborn, single-minded dudes in Roman political history. This man became absolutely obsessed with Carthage, unhealthily fixated. There's a famous story, and it's probably at least partially true, that no matter what topic was being debated in the Roman Senate, Cato would find a way to end his speech with the same line, Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendam, which translates to something like, furthermore, I am of the opinion that Carthage must be destroyed. Every single speech. About farming subsidies, Carthage must be destroyed. About road construction, Carthage must be destroyed. About some senator's disputed inheritance, you already know, Carthage must be destroyed. Cato had visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission and came back rattled. He'd seen how prosperous the city still was, saw figs in the market that were so fresh they must have been picked just 3 days prior in Carthage. He held up these figs in the Senate as evidence, look how close this thriving enemy is to our shores. We cannot let this stand. And look, Cato wasn't entirely wrong that Carthage was recovering, but his fear was arguably disproportionate to the actual threat at that point. Carthage was genuinely trying to stay in its lane. They weren't building up some secret war machine, they were just living, trading, rebuilding. But Roman hawks weren't trying to hear any of that. Meanwhile, things were getting complicated on the ground in North Africa. Carthage had this neighbor, the Numidian king Massinissa, who was a Roman ally and basically kept picking at Carthaginian territory. And because of the terms of the Second Punic War, Carthage couldn't go to war without Rome's approval. So Massinissa would raid, Carthage would complain to Rome, Rome would sort of shrug, and Massinissa would keep doing his thing. Eventually, after decades of this, Carthage snapped. They raised an army and fought back against Massinissa without Rome's permission. From a purely human standpoint, completely understandable. From a political standpoint, absolute disaster move. Because now Rome had their excuse. Carthage had technically violated the peace treaty by going to war without authorization. And in Rome, the warhawks, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, pounced. The Third Punic War, beginning in 149 BCE, wasn't really a war in any traditional sense. It was more like a prolonged execution. Rome sent a massive force to North Africa, and at first, Carthage tried to negotiate. They handed over hostages, they surrendered weapons and warships by the thousands, they were bending over backwards to avoid the worst. And then the Roman consul dropped the real demand: Carthage must be abandoned, the city must be torn down, and the population must relocate at least 10 miles inland, away from the sea, away from trade, away from everything that made Carthage, Carthage. This was basically a death sentence for the city's identity, even without a single sword being swung. And when that demand hit, something shifted in Carthage. The city collectively said, nah, no way, not happening. They had already given up their weapons, their ships, their hostages. They had bent the knee as far as they were willing to go. But abandoning the city itself, that was a bridge too far. And honestly, you kind of have to respect it. These people knew they were almost certainly doomed, knew that Rome had the manpower and the resources to just grind them into dust, and they chose to fight anyway. That decision, made in desperation and defiance, set the stage for one of the most brutal urban sieges in the ancient world. Carthage went into full emergency mode almost overnight. They melted down jewelry, sacred objects, anything metal to make new weapons. Women reportedly cut off their hair to make ropes for catapults and siege engines. The city threw itself into a frantic, desperate production of arms and armor. Ancient sources, with their usual flair for dramatic numbers, claim they were producing hundreds of shields, thousands of javelins, and over 100 catapults per day. Now, those exact numbers are probably inflated. Ancient historians love to go big, but the general picture is clear. This was a city that had decided to go down swinging. The early stages of the Roman assault didn't go smoothly. The Roman commanders weren't particularly competent, and Carthage's walls, which were absolutely massive, legendary in their construction, held firm. The city had a triple ring of defensive walls on the landward side, and its position on a peninsula made a naval assault incredibly difficult. So the siege dragged on, and Rome was looking kind of embarrassing, honestly. A superpower struggling to take down a city it had already effectively disarmed. That's a tough look. Enter Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal at Zama. Sometimes history just loves a full circle moment. Scipio Aemilianus was elected consul in 147 BCE, even though technically he was too young and hadn't held the required previous offices. Rome straight up bent their own rules because they needed someone who could actually get this done. And Scipio delivered. He reorganized the Roman forces, restored discipline which had apparently gotten pretty slack during the unsuccessful earlier campaigning, and started methodically tightening the noose around Carthage. He built a massive mole, essentially a huge wall across the harbor entrance, cutting the city off from resupply by sea. That was the kill shot for Carthage's logistics. Things inside the city got grim fast. No food coming in, no reinforcements, disease spreading, morale cratering, but the Carthaginians kept fighting. In 146 BCE, the Romans finally breached the outer defenses and got into the city itself. And this is where the story takes a turn that's genuinely hard to sit with, even thousands of years later. The street-by-street fighting through Carthage lasted for 6 days straight. 6 days of absolute chaos, house to house, rooftop to rooftop, floor by floor. The Romans would take a block, the Carthaginians would fall back and fight from the next building, and then from the next, and the next. Ancient sources describe Roman soldiers hacking through buildings from above, pulling down rooftops to make walkways, fighting over rubble while bodies, both Roman and Carthaginian, piled up below. The Roman general Scipio reportedly wept watching the city burn, and made some reference to the fall of Troy and the eventual end of Rome itself, because that's the kind of deep, philosophical guy. He apparently was even in the middle of absolute carnage. It's said that he quoted Homer, something about how even great cities one day must fall. Make it make sense that this dude was crying poetic while overseeing a massacre, but here we are. The final resistance centered around the Byrsa, the ancient citadel at the heart of Carthage. Around 50,000 survivors, men, women, children, whoever was still alive, had retreated there. They surrendered. They were enslaved. 50,000 people, whatever remained of one of the ancient world's great civilizations, sold into bondage. The Carthaginian general Hasdrubal, not to be confused with Hannibal's brother of the same name, ancient naming conventions were wild, had been negotiating a surrender. But his own wife reportedly lost it on him in front of the Romans. She called him a coward and a traitor, then threw herself and their children into the flames of the burning temple rather than be taken captive. Whether that story is completely accurate or somewhat dramatized by later writers, it became one of the defining images of Carthage's final moments, defiance unto death. After the fighting was done, the Romans got to work on what they had actually come to do. The city was systematically demolished. Every building was torn down, every wall knocked over. This wasn't disorganized looting, this was organized, thorough, deliberate erasure. The process took somewhere around 2 weeks of sustained demolition to level the physical city. Now, here's something that gets brought up a lot. You've probably heard that the Romans salted the earth of Carthage, so nothing would ever grow there again. It's one of those facts that everybody kind of knows that gets repeated in textbooks and documentaries and casual conversations. And here's the somewhat anticlimactic truth. There's no solid ancient source that actually describes this happening. The salting of Carthage is most likely a myth, or at best a later embellishment. The Romans didn't need to salt anything they had already accomplished the erasure through sheer physical destruction. But the myth stuck because it perfectly captures the intent behind what Rome did. The message was unmistakable regardless of whether actual salt was involved. Nothing here is supposed to survive. The land where Carthage had stood was declared cursed, formally placed, under a religious prohibition, what the Romans called a devotio against habitation. This wasn't just a military or political action. Rome was invoking religion, ritual, the weight of the gods themselves to ensure Carthage stayed dead. That's a level of thoroughness that goes beyond just winning. That's trying to reach back through time and unmake something. The Roman Senate voted to give out the land to neighboring peoples, and Rome basically wanted the physical memory of Carthage to dissolve into the landscape. Here's what makes this even more sobering when you really sit with it. Carthaginian civilization was almost entirely filtered through its enemies' accounts afterward. The Romans and Greeks who wrote about Carthage mostly wrote about it as an adversary, as a threat, as a symbol of decadence or barbarism or whatever narrative served their purposes. Carthage's own literature, its own records, its own version of its history, almost all of it was lost. Some of it was given to Numidian kings after the destruction, but most of those texts haven't survived either. So we're left with this civilization of genuinely immense historical significance, and we're largely reading about it through the perspective of the people who destroyed it. That's a kind of intellectual tragedy layered on top of the physical one, and some of the stuff the Romans said about Carthage was almost certainly propaganda or exaggeration. The most charged example is the question of child sacrifice. Ancient sources, particularly Roman ones, accuse the Carthaginians of regularly sacrificing children, particularly firstborn sons, to their god, Baal-Hamon, in a place called the Tophet. For a long time, modern scholars were skeptical, thinking this was enemy propaganda designed to paint Carthage as monsters. Then archaeologists actually excavated sites in Carthage and found urns containing the cremated remains of young children and infants. The debate shifted. Were these sacrificed children? Were they children who died young and were given a special burial? The scholarly argument over this is still genuinely ongoing, and the honest answer is that we don't fully know. What we do know is that the Romans used these accusations real, exaggerated, or somewhere in between to build a moral case for Carthage's destruction. Makes it a lot easier to wipe out a civilization if you can convince yourself and your audience that they were evil anyway. That's a playbook that, unfortunately, has never gone out of style. The site of Carthage didn't stay empty forever. Rome eventually reversed its own curse, as Rome tended to do when economics and practicality got involved. Julius Caesar floated the idea of rebuilding Carthage as a Roman colony, and his successor Augustus actually did it. A new Roman city rose on and around the ruins of the old Carthaginian one, eventually becoming one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire, a major center of early Christianity, and the home of figures like Tertullian and Augustine of Hippo. So the land itself survived. It's there today, just outside Tunis in Tunisia, and you can visit the archaeological ruins. But Carthage as a culture, as a people, as a living civilization with its own language and literature and religious traditions and way of seeing the world, that was gone. Genuinely, irreversibly gone. And the reason that matters isn't just historical sentiment. It's that the erasure of Carthage represents something that kept happening throughout history and honestly never fully stopped the deliberate destruction not just of a military enemy, but of an entire cultural existence. The burning of libraries, the suppression of languages, the demolition of monuments, the rewriting of histories, these are all echoes of what Rome did to Carthage, turned into a template, consciously or not, for how dominant powers have dealt with civilizations they found inconvenient. The total erasure of Carthage wasn't just a military victory, it was a statement. It said, "We don't just want to beat you, we want the world to forget you existed." And for a long time, it almost worked. But here we are, still talking about it. Still piecing together the fragments. Still asking what was really lost when those walls came down and those fires burned, and the salt, real or symbolic, was pressed into the wound. Carthage got deleted, yeah. But deletion, as it turns out, is never quite as permanent as the people doing the deleting want it to be.